Maria Rodriguez was holding a tray of coffee when her phone rang. The caller ID display showed only one thing: Pentagon. Urgent. Colonel Mitchell interrupted the conversation and told her, "Don't answer, you're just a cafe employee." But when Maria picked up the phone, the voice on the other end surprised everyone nearby. "General Rodriguez, we have a situation. The crisis room meeting will start in 10 minutes. This moment at the Fort Bragg Cafe became a moment no one would ever forget. Perhaps you've seen someone completely underestimated at some point. Maybe it happened to you at work, at school, or even in your family, but you've never seen it quite like this. When assumptions clash with reality so brutally that everyone involved begins to doubt everything they thought about the people around them, Maria Rodriguez had mastered the art of being unnoticeable. At 45, her worn hands and humble appearance allowed people to easily pass her by without noticing. She wore simple khaki pants and a white polo shirt with the embroidered logo of the Fort Bragg Volunteer Services on her chest. Her graying hair was pulled back into a practical ponytail, and she moved through the crowded military cafe with the unobtrusive efficiency of someone who had served food for many years. But no one at Fort Bragg knew that Maria Rodriguez held one of the most influential positions in the United States Armed Forces. As a three-star general, she commanded strategic operations in many theaters of war, advised the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and had direct access to the highest levels of national security intelligence. Her office in the Pentagon, located just 3 corridors from the Secretary of Defense's office, contained classified materials capable of changing global military strategy. But every year, Maria took exactly 2 weeks of leave, and for the past 5 years, she dedicated those 2 weeks to something that would surprise anyone who met her in Washington. She volunteered in military cafes, serving food to soldiers, clearing tables, and listening to the conversations of the men and women whose lives were affected by the decisions she was involved in. The idea began as a way to stay connected to the reality of the lowest level of military life. Maria had risen in 22 years from a second lieutenant, fresh out of West Point, to her current position as head of strategic operations for the entire Eastern Command. But with each promotion, she felt herself drifting further from the daily experiences of ordinary soldiers. "You can't lead people you don't understand," her mentor, General Patricia Hayes, had told her years ago, "and you can't understand people you never spend time with." These words accompanied Maria through every promotion, every meeting, every strategic decision affecting thousands of lives. So she developed her own system for staying connected. Every leave turned into a kind of intelligence mission, not for spying or gathering intelligence, but to remember what it was like to be at the lowest level of the military hierarchy, to hear unfiltered opinions about leadership decisions, to see firsthand how policies translated into the daily lives of the people who had to live with them. Maria had served coffee at bases in Georgia, Texas, California, and now in North Carolina. She always used her maiden name Rodriguez, not Rodriguez Chen, and always said she was taking a break from her office job in Washington. It wasn't entirely a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. The whole truth would have been too complicated, too disruptive to the genuine interaction she wanted to observe. What she learned during these covert assignments made her a better general. Policies that seemed perfect on paper showed their flaws when she saw soldiers struggling with their implementation. Training programs that worked well in controlled environments revealed weaknesses when she heard frustrated conversations in the mess halls. Equipment decisions that seemed financially justified became problematic when she observed their daily use in practice. But there was another reason Maria kept returning to these volunteer assignments, a reason she rarely admitted even to herself. She missed the feeling of usefulness in simple and immediate ways. At the Pentagon, her work involved abstract strategies, complex political calculations, and decisions whose consequences might not manifest for years. But here, serving coffee and clearing tables, she could see immediate results. A warm meal served with a smile, an attentive ear for a homesick soldier, a clean table ready for the next group. These small acts of service brought her a satisfaction that even successful military operations could not. This assignment at Fort Bragg was supposed to be the most routine of all. 2 weeks of serving breakfast and lunch, observing the daily rhythm of one of the most important Army bases, and then returning to Washington with new insights into operations and morale at the base. She had already spent 6 days there, adapting to the familiar pattern of unobtrusive efficiency that allowed her to blend perfectly into the background of military life. However, she did not expect to encounter Colonel James Mitchell. Colonel Mitchell embodied everything Maria had learned to recognize as problematic in military leadership. Competent enough to avoid serious disciplinary action, but arrogant enough to create a toxic atmosphere for anyone he considered beneath him. At 48, Mitchell had built a career based on impeccable uniform, perfect paperwork, and an amazing ability to position himself favorably with senior officers, while staying away from the real combat duties that usually shape humility in professional soldiers. His assignment at Fort Bragg was prestigious, Deputy Commander for Training Operations, but Maria had studied his file in advance. It showed a tendency toward lateral moves and administrative roles that allowed him to avoid combat deployments, while still steadily rising through the ranks. In Maria's professional judgment, he was precisely the type of officer who impresses on paper, but had never been tested by real character-revealing challenges. What made Mitchell particularly dangerous was his intelligence. He wasn't a caricature villain who barked orders and made obviously wrong decisions. He was cunning enough to disguise his prejudices as perfectly reasonable-looking rules, skilled enough in political navigation to avoid direct confrontation with his superiors, and charismatic enough to win over younger officers who admired his confidence and neatness. Maria had observed him for almost a week, noting how he interacted with different groups of people. With senior officers, he was reserved and informed. With peers, he was cordial and politically shrewd. With younger officers, he presented himself as a mentor and inspirer. But with enlisted personnel, support staff, and anyone he perceived as completely outside the military hierarchy, Mitchell revealed his true character. Maria saw him dismiss the suggestions of experienced non-commissioned officers without even considering them, interrupt civilian contractors trying to explain technical problems, and talk to the cafe workers, including herself, with thinly veiled contempt. His favorite phrase seemed to be, "Know your place," which he used to cut off any attempts at input from people he considered unqualified to offer opinions on military matters. The pattern of behavior was clear, and it was precisely the type of leadership dysfunction that Maria's position at the Pentagon allowed her to address when she found it. Officers like Mitchell created a toxic atmosphere that alienated talented individuals, reduced operational efficiency, and damaged the Army's relationship with the civilian communities it served. In her professional opinion, they represented a strategic risk that needed to be identified and corrected. But until that morning, Mitchell had never interacted with her directly, beyond basic courtesies when ordering coffee. That all changed when he decided to hold an impromptu meeting with 3 other officers at one of the tables near the service area, discussing what he clearly considered sensitive topics, believing that the service staff was not worth noticing. The morning began quite normally. Maria arrived at 6 a.m., 45 minutes before the cafe opened, to help with food preparation and coffee brewing. The other volunteers already knew her routine. She worked efficiently, never complained about assigned tasks, and had a natural ability to anticipate what was needed without being asked. They had stopped trying to make small talk after the first few days, accepting her preference for silent focus during the busy breakfast rush. By 7 a.m., the first soldiers had started arriving for breakfast, and Maria settled into her usual rhythm. She kept the coffee supplies stocked, cleared tables, and refilled condiment dispensers. It was during the quiet mid-morning period, around 10 a.m., that Colonel Mitchell arrived with 3 other officers for what appeared to be an informal strategy session. Maria was cleaning a nearby table when she heard Mitchell's voice, slightly above the usual conversation level. "The problem with these diversity initiatives," he was saying, "is that they prioritize the wrong things. We're supposed to care more about a person's background than their qualifications." One of the other officers, Major Williams, whom Maria recognized from previous mornings, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I don't know, sir. Some of the reports I've seen suggest that diverse perspectives actually improve decision-making in complex situations. Mitchell waved his hand dismissively. That's political correctness masquerading as military strategy. You think some guy from the inner city or a woman who's never seen combat is going to have the same insights as professional soldiers? Please. Maria continued cleaning. Her movements were steady and unnoticeable, but her attention sharpened. This was exactly the kind of conversation she had hoped to overhear. Unfiltered opinions from leaders that revealed their true views behind the superficial adherence to official regulations. What about General Hayes? Asked Captain Morrison, the youngest of the group. She's got more combat experience than most men in the Pentagon. Ah, an exception, Mitchell quickly retorted. And yet she was probably promoted faster than she should have been because the Army needed female generals for photo ops. Don't get me wrong, she's competent, but she didn't earn those stars the way a man would have to. Maria's jaw tightened slightly, but she kept working. General Hayes had been her mentor and friend for over 10 years. Patricia Hayes had earned every one of her 4 stars through exceptional leadership in the most challenging military assignments, including combat commands that most male officers were never offered. I think we should be careful about assumptions, Major Williams said quietly. Sometimes people surprise you. Mitchell leaned back in his chair, adopting the tone of someone explaining the obvious to a slow student. Williams, let me give you some advice. In 20 years in the military, I've learned to size people up pretty quickly. And most of the time, what you see is what you get. That woman over there, he pointed at Maria without lowering his voice, has been serving coffee here all week. That's her skill level. You think she has insights into military strategy that we need to hear? The other officers looked at Maria with obvious embarrassment on their faces. She continued cleaning, showing no reaction, but internally, she meticulously recorded every word spoken. I'm not saying we should ask the cafe staff for strategic advice, Williams said. I'm just saying maybe we shouldn't assume we know everything about someone based solely on their current job. That's exactly the kind of thinking that gets people into trouble, Mitchell countered firmly. Everyone wants to believe in hidden potential and untapped talent, but the reality is that most people end up where their abilities put them. She serves coffee because that's what she's qualified for. It's not rocket science. Captain Morrison looked increasingly uncomfortable. Perhaps we should discuss this in a more private setting, sir? Why? Is there anything here anyone else shouldn't hear? Mitchell replied. And frankly, it's important for young officers to understand how to accurately assess people. They can't be effective leaders if they're constantly second-guessing their instincts about who can contribute what to the mission. It was then that Maria's phone rang. The tone was discreet. A soft and professional ring Maria had specifically chosen to be unobtrusive in most situations. But in the relative quiet of the mid-morning cafe, it was loud enough to make all 4 officers turn towards the sound. Maria looked at the screen and felt her heartbeat quicken slightly. An urgent Pentagon call meant exactly what it implied. A situation had arisen that required her immediate attention, and her team was trying to reach her, despite her clear instructions not to take calls unless they were true emergencies. She looked up to see Colonel Mitchell staring at her with clear irritation. You need to take that outside, he said sharply. This is a professional setting. Excuse me, sir. Maria replied quietly, reaching for the phone. Actually, don't answer, Mitchell interrupted in a more authoritative tone. Are you on duty here? Personal calls can wait until your break. The other officers exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, but no one said a word. Maria paused for a moment, weighing her options. The call almost certainly concerned a real crisis. Her team knew emergency call protocol wasn't for routine matters, but answering would reveal her identity, ending her observational mission and potentially causing complications for everyone involved. The phone continued to ring. Mitchell's expression hardened further. Didn't you hear me? I said don't answer, he stated. Sir, Williams began, this might be important, more important than her doing her job. That's exactly what I'm talking about, Mitchell cut in. You have no sense of priorities or proper conduct in a professional environment. He glared at Maria. You are here to serve coffee and clear tables. Nothing more. Your personal life stays outside this building. Maria looked at the phone in her hand, then at Colonel Mitchell's impatient face, then at the awkward expressions of the other officers. In her mind, she quickly ran through the possible consequences of each option. She could ignore the call and maintain her cover, but if there truly was a crisis requiring her intervention, delay could have serious strategic implications. She could step outside and answer, which would likely satisfy Mitchell's immediate concern, but still might compromise her assignment if the conversation required disclosing classified information or her true position. Or she could answer the call right here, which would certainly end her covert mission, but allow her to address the emergency that prompted the call immediately. The decision made itself when the phone went silent for a moment, then immediately rang again. 2 rings on the emergency communication protocol meant the situation was deteriorating rapidly. "Excuse me," Maria said, looking directly at Colonel Mitchell, "but I need to take this." Mitchell's face flushed slightly. "What do you need, Maria?" The voice on the other end replied. "General Rodriguez," came the familiar voice of her Chief of Staff, Colonel Sarah Chen. "We have a developing situation in the Mediterranean. Carrier Strike Group Enterprise is reporting unusual activity from unidentified vessels, and satellite intelligence indicates possible coordination with hostile forces. The Secretary wants your assessment before making a decision on escalating the threat level." Maria, with full peripheral awareness, noticed Colonel Mitchell's mouth agape in astonishment, but her attention immediately focused on the briefing. "What's the timeline for the assessment?" 20 minutes, madam. The Chiefs of Staff are convening, and they need your input before they make recommendations to the President." "Understood. Connect me to the intelligence briefing. I need all satellite data and the latest reports from Enterprise's reconnaissance flights." "Yes, madam. Connecting now." As Maria listened to the initial intelligence summary, she watched Colonel Mitchell's face shift from confusion to disbelief, then to horror. The other officers remained motionless, seemingly trying to process the impossible sight before them. Over the next 15 minutes, Maria Rodriguez transformed from an unobtrusive cafe worker to who she always was, one of the most influential military leaders in the United States. Her voice took on an authoritative tone, the firmness of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected thousands of lives. Her questions were precise and targeted the strategic implications of the intelligence presented. Her analysis was swift and comprehensive, drawing connections between current events and broader geopolitical patterns that most officers never had access to. "The pattern indicates coordination," she said into the phone, staring at a point beyond the cafe walls, visualizing the strategic situation. "If these vessels are operating under state control, their positioning indicates preparation for interdiction tactics or reconnaissance before a major operation. I recommend raising the readiness level to DEFCON 3 for the fleet in the Mediterranean and increasing intelligence coverage in the targeted areas." Colonel Mitchell remained motionless. His coffee grew cold in front of him as Maria continued to engage in a conversation that was clearly taking place at the highest levels of military command. The other officers looked equally stunned, but their expressions reflected admiration rather than horror. They understood they were witnessing something exceptional. "Negative," Maria continued, responding to a question from another participant on the Pentagon brief. "Deployment of ground forces would be too provocative at this stage. We need naval solutions that demonstrate capability without escalating. The carrier group has everything it needs to respond adequately if the situation deteriorates." She paused, listening to additional comments from others on the call. Faint voices of multiple individuals could be heard over the phone, confirming it was a high-level strategic session involving several senior officers. "All right," Maria finally said. "Maintain current posture, but prepare for rapid response options. I want an hourly update on vessel movements and any changes in their operational patterns. Inform NATO liaison. If the situation escalates, we'll need coordinated response protocols." As she ended the call, Maria's attention returned to her immediate surroundings. The cafe seemed unusually quiet, and Maria noticed that other conversations in the room had gradually died down. People were becoming aware that something unusual was happening at the officers' table. "Thank you, Colonel Chen," Maria said into the phone. "I'll be available for a follow-up brief in 2 hours. Maintain constant observation of the situation." She hung up and looked at the 4 officers sitting opposite her. Colonel Mitchell was visibly struggling to breathe normally. Major Williams and Captain Morrison stared at her with expressions of surprise and curiosity. Only Lieutenant Colonel Barnes, who had been silent throughout the previous exchange, seemed composed enough to speak. "Ma'am," Barnes said carefully, "I believe there might be some misunderstanding here." "There is no misunderstanding," Maria replied simply. "I am General Maria Rodriguez, Chief of Strategic Operations for Eastern Command. I've been here for a week as part of a personal observation assignment." She looked directly at Colonel Mitchell. "My apologies for the deception, but I wanted to observe the base's ordinary operations without the complications my uniformed presence would cause." Mitchell finally found his voice, though it was barely a whisper. "You're actually a 3-star general?" "Yes," Maria confirmed. "I report directly to the Joint Chiefs of Staff." She made a fleeting gesture towards the phone she had just used. That was a real crisis, requiring immediate strategic assessment. It's a decision that affects regional security and potentially global stability. There was a pause for several seconds as the implications sank in for the group. Other people in the cafe began to notice the unusual tension at the officers' table, and Maria realized her cover was fully blown to everyone present. "Sir," Major Williams said carefully to Mitchell, "I think you should apologize to the general." Mitchell's face had gone through several color changes in the past few minutes, finally settling on a pale shade that spoke of a complete understanding of the gravity of the situation. I had no idea. I mean, how could I have known?" "You couldn't have known my identity," Maria replied calmly. "But you could have treated me with basic human dignity, regardless of what you assumed about my background or qualifications." News of the incident spread through Fort Bragg with the kind of speed only military rumors can achieve. By lunchtime, everyone on base had heard some version of the story. A 3-star general working undercover in the cafe, and Colonel Mitchell making comments that revealed his true attitudes towards women, minorities, and anyone he considered beneath his rank. The different versions of the tale grew more dramatic with each telling, but the core facts remained consistent enough for senior leadership to quickly realize they had a serious problem. Not only had a general been inadvertently insulted by one of her subordinates, but the incident had occurred with witnesses and in a public place, making a quiet resolution impossible. Maria found herself in the unusual position of managing both her original observational mission and the crisis caused by the exposure of her identity. She quickly arranged a private meeting with the base commander, Major General David Sullivan, to explain her presence and assess the fallout. "General Rodriguez," Sullivan said when they met in his office an hour later, "I have to ask, how much of this was intentional?" Maria considered the question carefully. "None of it, sir. My presence here was solely for personal observation. I did not intend to create a confrontational situation or to embarrass any of the officers, but I did observe problematic behavior. Yes, sir. Colonel Mitchell's comments this morning were consistent with patterns of behavior I had observed throughout my mission here. His attitudes towards diversity, the assumption of ability based on appearance, and his interactions with support staff indicate a leadership style that could be detrimental to unit cohesion and operational effectiveness." Sullivan nodded gravely. "What are your recommendations for moving forward?" "That depends on your assessment. Is this incident an isolated lapse in judgment, or a systemic pattern of behavior requiring systemic intervention?" "From my observations, it's the latter." What followed was a week of intense analysis that extended far beyond the initial incident. Maria's detailed observations of base operations, combined with her unique perspective on leadership effectiveness at the strategic level, provided insights that prompted a comprehensive review of the command culture at Fort Bragg. Colonel Mitchell submitted a formal letter of apology, acknowledging his disrespectful behavior and his failure to recognize the problematic assumptions underlying his comments. But the damage to his reputation and career prospects was significant. Within 6 months, he was transferred to a logistics position that effectively ended his chance for career advancement. More importantly, the incident sparked much broader discussions about unconscious bias, respect for all service members regardless of their roles, and the importance of maintaining professional standards in all interactions. Maria's experience became a case study used in leadership training programs across the Army. For Maria, the experience provided lessons far beyond her initial observation goals. The weeks spent immersed in unfiltered opinions about military leadership offered valuable data on how policies and decisions were perceived at the base level. But the confrontation with Colonel Mitchell revealed something more to her: the importance of standing up for principles, even if it entailed personal cost. "You could have avoided this whole situation," her mentor, General Hayes, told her during a call a week later. "You could have ignored the call or stepped outside to answer. Why did you choose to confront him directly?" the general asked. Maria paused for a moment. "Because avoiding confrontation when someone exhibits prejudice and disrespect isn't avoiding anything, it's allowing it to happen." Mitchell felt comfortable making those remarks because he thought no one with the authority to challenge him was listening. But someone with that authority was listening, and I had a duty to respond, even if it jeopardized my mission. The mission was to understand how leadership decisions affect real people in real situations. At that moment, I became one of those real people affected by poor leadership. The most valuable insight I could gain was my own reaction to that situation. This conversation helped Maria clarify what she had been contemplating since the incident: the importance of leaders being willing to experience the same conditions and attitudes they expected from others. Her covert assignments had shown her that military hierarchy could create distance between those who make decisions and the consequences of those decisions. But they also showed her that this distance could be bridged through intentional effort and a genuine desire for understanding. Over the following months, Maria expanded her observational missions, visiting more bases and taking on different roles. Each experience gave her new insights into the daily reality of military life and how strategic decisions translated into personal experiences for service members. Furthermore, she implemented changes in her leadership approach at the Pentagon. She introduced regular direct feedback sessions where enlisted personnel and junior officers could voice opinions on policy implementation. She established channels for anonymous feedback on leadership effectiveness and made a point of spending time outside formal settings where she could observe unfiltered interactions between different levels of the military hierarchy. The incident at Fort Bragg was incorporated into military leadership curricula, but not in the way Colonel Mitchell might have feared. Rather than focusing on the embarrassment of misidentification, the study emphasized the importance of treating all individuals with respect, regardless of their status or perceived role. "The problem wasn't that Colonel Mitchell didn't recognize a general," explained Major General Patricia Hayes during a leadership seminar 6 months later. "The problem was that he treated someone disrespectfully based on assumptions about their background and abilities. Even if Maria Rodriguez had truly been an ordinary cafe worker, his behavior would have been just as inappropriate and unprofessional." The story also resonated beyond military circles when a carefully anonymized version was included as a Harvard Business School case study on leadership and unconscious bias. This sparked extensive debate about how assumptions based on appearance, role, or background can blind leaders to valuable perspectives and damage organizational effectiveness. For Maria, the broader impact was both satisfying and instructive. She was pleased that her experience could contribute to improved leadership training and the development of more inclusive organizational cultures. But she was also keenly aware that changing deeply ingrained attitudes required sustained effort and vigilant oversight. "One incident doesn't transform an entire culture," she reflected during an interview for a military leadership magazine. "But it can serve as a catalyst for those who are already ready to re-examine their own assumptions and behaviors." The key is creating an environment where such questions can be asked constructively, not defensively. 2 years after the Fort Bragg incident, Maria Rodriguez was promoted to 4-star general, becoming one of the highest-ranking Hispanic officers in military history. The promotion ceremony took place at the Pentagon, attended by hundreds of senior officers, government officials, and family members. In her speech, she spoke about the importance of leaders staying connected to the people they serve and the value of understanding military life from different perspectives. But she also told the story that many in the audience already knew. The story of the phone call that changed everything for everyone involved. Leadership requires the ability to see beyond superficial appearances and initial assumptions, she said. It requires treating every person with dignity and respect, regardless of their current role or perceived status. And it requires the humility to recognize that the most valuable insights can come from the most unexpected sources. In the audience, Major Williams, now Lieutenant Colonel Williams, listened with a smile. He had been promoted twice since the Fort Bragg incident, thanks in part to his ability to question assumptions and consider alternative perspectives in complex situations. Colonel Mitchell was not present. After his transfer to logistics, he opted for early retirement rather than face the career limitations imposed by his tarnished reputation. Official records merely reflected that he received counseling on leadership development opportunities, but everyone in his professional network knew what had truly transpired. However, the most significant moment of the ceremony came during the subsequent reception, when a young Hispanic soldier approached Maria to thank her for her example and inspiration. "My little sister wants to go to West Point because of you," he said. "She says if a general can serve coffee, she can do anything." Maria smiled and shook his hand. "Tell your sister she is absolutely right, and tell her that the most important thing is not what job you do, but how you treat people while doing it." As the reception continued around her, Maria reflected on the journey that had led her to this moment. The phone call at Fort Bragg had been unexpected, but it was exactly what was needed. A moment when appearances were deceiving, and true character was revealed for all to see. Sometimes the most powerful lessons come from the most mundane moments. Sometimes the most important conversations happen in cafes and break rooms, not in boardrooms or command centers. And sometimes, the person serving you coffee is precisely the person you should listen to most carefully. Quiet people often carry the most important stories within them. Here in the United States, sometimes we forget that everyone around us has chapters in their lives that we cannot see just by looking at them. The woman who cleans your office might be putting herself through her doctorate by working nights. The man who takes your order might be a veteran with decades of leadership experience. The person you dismiss as knowing nothing about your industry might have insights that change your understanding of everything you thought you knew. If you were Colonel Mitchell, would you apologize and try to learn from this experience, or would you look for ways to minimize what happened? Let me know in the comments, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, where we celebrate the hidden power and unexpected wisdom that surround us every day.